I stood frozen in my driveway, the heat from the flames pressing against my face. My car, my perfectly good Ford sedan, was burning. Thick black smoke curling into the night sky. The fire crackled, the metal groaned, and the stench of burning rubber filled the air. Across the street, Sandra Whitmore, the HOA president, stood with her arms crossed, watching. She wasn't panicked. She wasn't calling for help. She was smiling. Then she turned to me, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "Next time, you'll think twice about refusing to join." She said it so casually, like this was just another rule she was enforcing. Like setting my car on fire was a perfectly reasonable consequence for not signing her ridiculous HOA agreement. What she didn't realize, what she couldn't realize, was who she had just threatened. For 15 years, I had put people like her behind bars. Organized crime, racketeering, extortion. I knew the playbook better than anyone because I was the one who tore it apart, case by case, gang by gang. Sandra thought she was dealing with some stubborn homeowner, someone she could bully into submission. She had no idea that she had just picked a fight with the one person in this neighborhood who knew exactly how to destroy her. What happens when a neighborhood tyrant picks the worst possible person to terrorize? She was about to find out. After years of dealing with criminals, courtrooms, and endless late nights building cases, I was ready for peace. A quiet home, a simple neighborhood, no more battles. Oak Ridge Estates looked perfect. Manicured lawns, spotless sidewalks, families walking their dogs. It was the kind of place where people smiled when they passed you on the street. It felt like a fresh start. Moving day was surprisingly smooth. A few neighbors even stopped by with welcome baskets, cookies, candles, little handwritten notes. It was almost too perfect. But I wasn't complaining. For the first time in years, I felt like I could just live without looking over my shoulder. Then I saw her. Across the street, a woman stood with a clipboard, watching. Not in the friendly, curious way most neighbors do. She was studying me, taking in every box I carried, every piece of furniture unloaded. Her lips were pressed into a thin line, her grip on that clipboard tight. The next morning, my doorbell rang at exactly 7 a.m. I opened the door to find the same woman standing there, her pearl necklace gleaming against her crisp blazer. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Welcome to Oak Ridge," she said smoothly. "I'm Sandra Whitmore, president of the Homeowners Association. I brought your membership papers." She handed me a thick stack of documents, 47 pages of rules, restrictions, and fees that seemed way too high for what little they offered. "I appreciate it," I said, flipping through the pages. "But I'll pass." Her smile flickered. "Everyone joins the HOA, Mr. Carter. It's practically mandatory." I raised an eyebrow. "Practically isn't the same as legally required." I handed the papers back. For the first time, something in her eyes shifted, something cold and calculating. "You don't understand," she said, her tone just a little too firm. "The HOA protects everyone's interests." "I'm sure it does," I replied. "But I'll manage my property my own way, thanks." Her expression hardened. "That's unfortunate," she said quietly. "Residents who don't participate often find life difficult." I'd heard that tone before. Not from homeowners association presidents, but from mob enforcers, crime bosses, men who ran entire cities from the shadows. This wasn't a polite invitation. This was a warning. Sandra Whitmore thought she was in control of this neighborhood. She had no idea she had just tried to intimidate the wrong man. At first, it was little things. A letter in my mailbox informing me that my grass was too long, even though it looked exactly like my neighbor's. Then another one, saying my mailbox was 3 inches too tall. A few days later, a third notice arrived, claiming I had put my garbage bins out too early. At first, I thought it was just typical HOA nonsense. Annoying, but nothing serious. Then I started noticing the way people acted. Neighbors who had smiled and waved when I first moved in now looked away when I walked past. Conversation stopped when I approached. Even the friendly couple who had brought me cookies on moving day suddenly seemed like they didn't want to be seen talking to me. Then came the note. It was tucked under my windshield wiper, written in thick black marker. Conform or leave. No name, no signature. Just a message. A threat. That night, I sat in my living room staring at the note, my instincts kicking in. I'd seen tactics like this before. Pressure, isolation, intimidation. In the courtroom, I had put away men who used the exact same playbook. The only difference? Instead of a criminal syndicate, this was an HOA board. A knock at my door pulled me from my thoughts. Bill Henderson, the man who lived 2 doors down, stood on my porch, glancing nervously over his shoulder. I motioned him inside. "Look," he said, keeping his voice low. "I probably shouldn't be here, but I just wanted to warn you." I raised an eyebrow. "Warn me about what?" He let out a breath. "Before you moved in, there were the Thompsons. They refused to join the HOA too. At first it was little things. Petty fines, parking tickets, that kind of stuff. Then their kids' bikes started getting vandalized. A few weeks later, their dog got sick. Real sick. The vet said it was poison. I felt my jaw tighten. And no one did anything? Bill shook his head. They moved within 3 months, sold their house for way less than it was worth. Sandra made sure the next buyers signed the HOA contract before the deal even closed. I leaned back in my chair, letting his words sink in. The random violations, the social isolation, the anonymous threats. None of this was new. It was a pattern, a strategy. Bill hesitated, then spoke again. "Look, I don't want any trouble, but she keeps files on people. She knows exactly how to push them out if she wants to. Just be careful." I nodded. "Thanks for the warning, Bill." As he left, I reached for my phone and quietly opened a recording app. From that moment on, I documented everything. Every conversation, every violation notice, every suspicious encounter. Sandra Whitmore thought she was playing a game of intimidation. What she didn't realize was that I had just started building my case against her. I wasn't going to sit back and wait for whatever the HOA had planned next. If they wanted to play games, I was going to play smarter. The first step was surveillance. I installed cameras, some out in the open, right above my front door and garage, to make it clear I was watching. The others? Hidden, placed strategically around my property. I wanted to catch them in the act, not just scare them off. It didn't take long. A motion alert woke me up at 3:17 a.m. I checked my phone and saw the live feed. Sandra Whitmore, dressed in all black, creeping onto my lawn. She pulled out a ruler and measured the length of my grass. Then she walked over to my mailbox, taking pictures from different angles. I should have confronted her. Instead, I let her do exactly what she came to do: commit trespassing on camera. The next morning, I took things a step further. If Sandra and her board wanted to enforce ridiculous rules, I was going to see if they followed them themselves. I walked the neighborhood before dawn, snapping pictures. Jim Baker, the HOA vice president? His fence was too tall. Treasurer Helen Porter? Her front yard had unapproved decorations. Sandra herself? Her porch lights weren't up to code. Pure hypocrisy. And now? I had proof. But I wasn't just looking for petty violations. Something bigger was going on. I started digging. Through an old contact at the FBI, I ran a quiet background check. That's when I found it. Sandra Whitmore had a sealed embezzlement conviction. Before running Oak Ridge Estates, she'd been in charge of an HOA in Florida, until $300,000 went missing, and she was quietly removed. No jail time, no press, just a fresh start in a new state. But she didn't do it alone. Helen Porter, the treasurer, settled an insurance fraud case out of court. Another board member had ties to a construction company that kept winning HOA contracts, despite never actually doing the work. This wasn't just a power-hungry woman running a neighborhood. It was an organized scam. Then came the biggest discovery of all. Sandra had a storage unit rented under her maiden name. I followed the HOA's maintenance guy there, watching as he unlocked it and carried in a stack of folders. That night, I got a warrant. By morning, I was standing inside that storage unit, staring at the truth. Files. Dozens of them. Personal data on every resident who had ever challenged Sandra. Financial records, surveillance photos, detailed notes on their habits and weak spots. And then I saw the worst part, a folder labeled Elimination Successes. Inside, names, addresses, and timelines of families who had been forced out. Notes on how they were pressured, the fines they were hit with, even pictures of their moving trucks. Sandra wasn't just running an HOA, she was running a criminal operation. And now I had everything I needed to take her down. Sandra wasn't backing down. In fact, she was getting bolder. One morning I stepped into the shower, only to be hit with ice-cold water. At first I thought it was just a plumbing issue, but after checking with my neighbors, I realized I was the only one without water. When I called the utility company, they claimed it was due to unpaid fees. Funny, since I had the receipts proving I was paid up 6 months in advance. The next day, I went to grab my mail and found my envelopes ripped open, bills missing, and an official document crumpled like trash. When I reported it to the post office, they told me it looked like someone had tampered with my mailbox. Then came the birds, 3 of them. Dead. Carefully arranged on my welcome mat. Not roadkill, not an accident. A message. And just when I thought they couldn't sink any lower, I picked up the latest HOA newsletter. Right there, under Community Concerns, was a paragraph about an unnamed homeowner who had been displaying suspicious behavior, refusing to contribute, and possibly engaging in illegal activity. Sandra wasn't just harassing me. She was turning the entire neighborhood against me. That's when I knew it was time to hit back. I wasn't the only one suffering under Sandra's rule. Over the past few weeks, I had quietly identified other victims. Alice Greenberg, an 83-year-old widow, fined $750 for unauthorized wind chimes. Carlos Mendez, a landscaper whose HOA contracts were mysteriously revoked after he questioned rising fees. Tom Franklin, a disabled veteran who had been denied an accessibility ramp for his own home. One by one, I met with them. At first, they were hesitant, too scared to get involved. But when I showed them the files I had gathered, something changed. They realized they weren't alone. Together, we built a resistance. Alice let me use her home as a meeting spot. Sandra's goons wouldn't suspect an elderly woman. Carlos had contacts in local businesses who had been overcharged for fake HOA improvements. Tom? He had recordings of board meetings where Sandra openly mocked disabled residents. Every piece of evidence made the picture clearer. This wasn't just an HOA gone bad. This was organized fraud, extortion, and intimidation. Then came the final confirmation. Through my FBI contacts, I got my hands on financial records that should have never existed. Sandra's consulting firm had been receiving direct payments from the HOA budget. The treasurer, Helen, had personally signed off on thousands of dollars in special project fees that didn't exist. City inspectors who kept citing homeowners, they had direct deposits from Sandra's personal account. This wasn't just corruption. This was racketeering. Sandra thought she was in control. She thought I was just another homeowner she could bully into submission. She had no idea that in just a few days, I was going to turn her entire empire into rubble. The community center was packed. Every homeowner in Oak Ridge Estates was required to attend the quarterly HOA meeting, another one of Sandra's power plays. She wanted to remind people who was in charge. Sandra stood at the front of the room, perfectly poised, flashing that fake smile as she launched into her usual speech about community standards and necessary improvements. Then she got to the real reason we were there. As you all know, she said smoothly, security is a top priority in our neighborhood. To ensure continued protection, the board has voted to implement a mandatory $500 security fee for every household. A murmur ran through the crowd. People glanced at each other, confused. Some nodded along, already conditioned to accept whatever she demanded. But others, especially the ones I had spoken to, were starting to see through her. I raised my hand. Question. Sandra barely looked at me. Mr. Carter, this isn't the time for— Actually, I interrupted, it's the perfect time, because I've been looking at the HOA's financial records. I held up a stack of documents. And I have one very simple question. There's a $43,000 consulting fee listed here. Who's getting paid? And for what? The room fell silent. Sandra's smile tightened. Those are standard operational expenses. For what operations? I pressed. Because from what I can see, this money isn't going toward actual improvements. It's just disappearing. She waved a hand dismissively. Financial details are only available to official HOA members, Mr. Carter. If you had joined like everyone else, you wouldn't have these concerns. That was her mistake. Because public HOA financials are required by law. I held up another document. According to state law, all homeowners, members or not, have the right to financial transparency when fees are mandatory. So again, Sandra, where's the money going? People in the crowd were shifting now, whispering. Suspicion spread across their faces. They were finally paying attention. Sandra's confidence cracked. Her fingers clenched the podium, and for the first time, she looked nervous. But then, just as quickly, she recovered. And when she spoke, her voice was lower, sharper. Some people, she said, her eyes locking onto mine, don't understand how fragile a peaceful neighborhood can be, and some tragedies are preventable. A chill ran through the room. It was a threat, a public one, and she didn't even try to hide it. What she didn't know was that hidden recording devices had just captured every word. Sandra thought she could intimidate me into silence. She had no idea that she had just sealed her own fate. It happened fast. A sharp crash outside yanked me out of sleep. I bolted upright, heart pounding. I moved to the window, pushing the curtain back just enough to see. Someone was outside, Sandra. She was standing by my car, a gas can in one hand, a match in the other. My security lights flicked on, flooding the driveway with light. But she didn't run. She didn't even look around to see if anyone was watching. She just poured the gasoline over the hood, struck the match, and let it drop. The fire whooshed to life instantly, flames licking up the windshield. The heat was intense, even from inside my house. But Sandra? She just stepped back, crossed her arms, and watched it burn. The sick satisfaction on her face told me everything. She wanted me to see this. She wanted the entire neighborhood to see this. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. My cameras had already captured everything, but I needed to make it official. "A woman just set my car on fire," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Her name is Sandra Whitmore." But when the police arrived, I immediately knew something was off. The two officers barely glanced at my burning car before turning to Sandra. They weren't questioning her. They were listening. Sandra let out a dramatic sigh. "I was home sleeping," she said, shaking her head. "I have no idea what happened here." One of the officers turned to me. "We'll file a report," he said, completely uninterested. "But this looks like an electrical malfunction." I stared at him. The smell of gasoline still hung in the air. The security footage showed everything. And yet, they were already trying to cover for her. That's when Sandra walked past me, just close enough to whisper, "Next time it might not be just your car." I didn't flinch, didn't react. But inside, I was already making my next move. Sandra had just made the biggest mistake of her life, and she had no idea what was coming next. Sandra had spent years making sure she was untouchable. Every fine, every forced eviction, every stolen dollar had been carefully hidden under layers of fake paperwork and corrupt connections. But that only worked when no one was watching. Now, everyone was watching. At exactly 6 a.m., FBI tactical teams hit 7 locations at once: Sandra's house, the HOA office, the storage unit, and the homes of every board member involved. There were no warnings, no negotiations, just flashing lights, armed agents, and arrest warrants with their names on them. Sandra was still in her bathrobe when they pulled her from her house. She didn't look smug anymore. As she was led to the waiting car, I stepped forward, my badge visible on my belt. Federal Prosecutor Mark Carter, Organized Crime Division. The blood drained from her face. Sandra had spent all this time trying to intimidate the wrong man. Now, she was the one about to lose everything. The courtroom was packed. Homeowners from Oak Ridge Estates filled the seats, watching as the case against Sandra Whitmore and her corrupt HOA board unfolded. The evidence was overwhelming. The prosecution laid it all out. $1.2 million stolen over 5 years, funneled through fake maintenance fees, bogus fines, and fraudulent improvement projects that never happened. They presented bank records, wire transfers, and emails detailing exactly how Sandra had bled the community dry while pretending to enforce neighborhood standards. Then came the video. On the screen, Sandra appeared in the glow of security lights, pouring gasoline over my car. The jury gasped as the match dropped, flames erupting on the screen. There was no excuse for what they were watching, no way to explain it away. Then came the testimonies. Alice Greenberg, the 83-year-old widow, spoke about how Sandra had fined her nearly a month's worth of Social Security for hanging wind chimes. Carlos Mendez, the landscaper, described how his business was blacklisted after questioning HOA contracts. The Wilson family recalled threats, vandalism, and a sudden drop in business after refusing to comply. By the time the prosecution rested, Sandra's usual arrogance was gone. But when she took the stand, she still tried to talk her way out of it. "This is a misunderstanding," she snapped, her voice sharp with desperation. "I was protecting the community, keeping things in order. People like him don't understand what it takes to run a neighborhood." I met her eyes from across the room. Then I stood, adjusting my suit before delivering the final blow. "You weren't running a neighborhood," I said, my voice calm but firm. "You were running a crime syndicate." The courtroom fell silent. The judge didn't take long to deliver her decision. Guilty on all counts. Sandra got 15 years for racketeering, arson, and mail fraud. The rest of the board? Sentences ranging from 5 to 12 years. As she was led out in handcuffs, Sandra looked at me one last time. Her voice was barely a whisper. "I should have checked who you were before I burned your car." I smiled. "Yeah, you really should have." With Sandra gone and the HOA dismantled, everything changed. For the first time in years, people in Oak Ridge Estates could breathe. No more random fines, no more intimidation, no more fear. The ridiculous 73-page rulebook was shredded and replaced with a simple, voluntary agreement, one that actually put neighbors before power. At first, it was awkward. People had spent so long avoiding each other, afraid to speak out. But little by little, that changed. Conversations started happening again. People who once lived in silent fear now stopped to chat in their driveways. Kids rode bikes without their parents worrying about getting a violation notice the next morning. And the stolen money? It was returned. The fines, the bogus fees, every dollar Sandra and her board had taken was given back. Alice Greenberg, the elderly widow who had nearly lost her home over a wind chime fine, cried when she got her check. But the impact of this case went beyond Oak Ridge Estates. News of Sandra's conviction spread fast. Homeowners across the country came forward, sharing their own stories of corrupt HOA boards running neighborhoods like personal kingdoms. Investigations were launched. Congressional hearings were held. New laws were passed, making sure no HOA could ever operate in the shadows like this again. And Sandra? She never saw it coming. As she was led away in handcuffs, she turned to me, her voice low, her face pale. "I should have checked who you were first," I smirked, watching the officers load her into the transport van. "Yeah, you really should have."